Before we begin, thank you very much to Giratina, a person, not the Pokemon, for joining the Patreon campaign over at patreon.com/ TJOmega. So, at the highest level of my Patreon, it used to be you get to make any kind of video review request. Well, that's hard these days because no one really knows what's in my collection anymore because I've sold off so much of it. And, well, I can't depend on reviews the way I used to. So I opened it up. Now you can ask for any sort of video based on anything that is in the similar vein to what I've been doing on this channel for the last few months. And that's what this is. Today I am answering a request to discuss a particular part of Transformers fiction. Specifically, the IDW run of Autobot Megatron. This one's divisive. I have people who absolutely hate IDW and what they've been doing. I have people who adamantly hate the idea of Megatron being an Autobot or a good guy in any way, shape, or form. So let's get things out of the way here. Just to begin with, when it comes to current IDW, I am with you in that I hate current IDW. I think the stories are boring. I think they are too slow paced. And I think they're trying to introduce too many characters like they're big deals when they're not. They're not. They're brand new people. We have no explanation or build up for. And I don't think I don't think how the story of I don't think how the war began between Autobots and Decepticons is an interesting story because ultimately it's not a story that matters. We know how it goes. Megatron rises up, Orion Pax becomes Optimus Prime, the war spills to Earth. And that's just kind of how it goes until, we get to some new stuff. And to change that formula basically changes, the origin point of Transformer stories, and that gets a little bit messier. So I'm not interested in it. It's a story. It's more interesting. It's more interesting to ask the question, how did we get here, rather than how did it start? Because how do we get here has more context and contrast to it. It makes seeing the origins of the Transformers war interesting to see. Seeing it right from the get-go by itself, dull. So that's where I stand on current IDW. The only one I'm following is Beast Wars. I actually kind of like what they're doing on Beast Wars. IDW 1.0 has its hits and misses. I'm not a fan of how they did Sunstreaker and Hunter. I'm not a fan of, I think a lot of people didn't like the Dark Cybertron storyline overall. I think it got better toward the end, at least. But when it comes to More Than Meets the Eye, which I believe is the first comic, they threw around the name so much, it's hard for me to keep track. But what evolved into Lost Light is one of my favorite runs of Transformers because it was clearly writers who were just trying to have fun but still piecing in things to an overarching story. A lot of elements seeded in early issues that came back, 2 years later in the fiction. Some impressive storytelling going on, to be sure. And genuinely, even if you weren't a fan of how the stories went or how jovial the tone of those books were, you have to admit, to be able to weave what they did and work all the details in and remember things that happened years ago in real time, and then to bring them back like it was all part of the plan, and a lot of it was part of the plan, is a really impressive feat of writing. And considering they got more of an abrupt stop to that one, as they suddenly, and as IDW suddenly announced, no, we're resetting, we're rebooting, so wrap everything up, chop chop. More impressive than that. I want to do a what if someday of what if IDW 1.0 continued and figure out what would the next story beat be. But that's just to give you the groundwork of where I stand on IDW. If you hate IDW, no matter what, there's not going to be a video for you, because I'm going to be praising a lot of what they've done. And otherwise, enjoy the ride, because that's the whole point of the Autobot Megatron storyline, is the ride. So what I liked about the writing in IDW 1.0 is they asked the question, why are the characters the way they are? They weren't just content with Megatron, like the G1 cartoon. They weren't content with the G1 cartoon's idea of one day Megatron was built. He ran 10 feet, shot the Autobot leader dead, and that was the beginning of the Third Cybertronian War, yada yada yada. Um, and yeah, because I don't like that. I like a villain to have depth and nuance and a reason for why they are, not just, oh, I was built to be evil, so hey, I'm evil. That's not interesting. G1 Megatron, in and of himself, he makes a good after school cartoon villain because he's a just genuinely dislikable villain that is fun to see get shot and punched by Optimus Prime. But as a character, he has a little bit of nuance the few times he actually does work with Optimus, mostly to save his own skin, but he doesn't really have any depth to him beyond that. So to hold him up as like every Megatron should always be like that, I think is so narrow. And you deny yourself so many opportunities to have interesting stories with the character when you want them to be that one note. So with what IDW did, they asked why is a character the way they are. In the case of, for instance, Shockwave, it was because, Shockwave was the way he was because he was a senator who stood up to the corruption in the Autobot Council and was sentenced to Emperata, the removal of his original head and hands, and even further, the removal of his emotions. So it was a really twisted way of creating Shockwave to be the cold, logical creature that he became. In the case of Starscream, they were asked why is Starscream so vain and power hungry? It's because he was constructed cold, which meant his body was pre-built and a spark was implanted into it, rather than being forged, which is the living metal of Cybertron forming around a spark and slowly shaping itself into the transformer that the spark was meant to be. Because of that, Starscream was never comfortable in his own body. He was never satisfied with what he was or who he had because he always felt he wasn't good enough, or he wasn't happy with his design at any point because he always felt like it was wrong, that the body that he was in. You know, and I've got viewers who can probably relate to some of those feelings. So they were coming up with ways of explaining the characters, and I liked that. It made them more interesting rather than just being cookie cutter cartoons, personalities. It actually had depth. When you give reason for the character, it makes them more interesting. In the case of Megatron, now that we're like, I don't know what, 8 minutes into the video, and now I'm just getting around to talking about Megatron. There's a lot to set up here first, just to make sure where my mindset comes from. So he starts off as a working class bot that the Autobot Council at the time, the corrupt Autobot Council, saw as inferior, a lesser class, and were treated as such. In his early days, Megatron, as a tunnel worker, wanted to be he wanted to be a medic. And he was a poet. He wanted to help fellow Cybertronians. And when the council became too much, helping his fellow Cybertronians meant creating the rebellion against an oppressive Autobot leadership. Now, at the time, Megatron was, in that rebel position. He's a Han Solo, or not, well, not even a Han Solo. He's like if Leia eventually went to. He's like Leia, but if Leia eventually went to the dark side. That's about the best equivalent I could come to. It starts with good intentions, as rebellions often do. Um, Good intentions to overthrow someone, and for the sake of freedom and fairness, and then everything gets twisted. The longer it went, the more twisted Megatron became. The more the Autobots resisted being overthrown, the more extreme Megatron had to get. So the idea went from we need freedom, we need to be treated as equals, to the Autobots are in the way and they must be removed so that we can have our freedom. And the hatred that was grown through war with the Autobots is eventually what made that mentality go to, I have to control everything if it means getting rid of the Autobots. It's happened. You can draw so many parallels in our own human history to that story. It has happened time and time again throughout human civilization, where someone, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? Someone who decided they were going to speak out and become, and against the oppressors became the oppressor because that's what they felt was right. In their own head, they were always following the same mission, but they weren't aware of how extreme they had to get, or that they became worse than what they were trying to overthrow in the first place. It's what corruption does. It's what power does. And when you're controlling an entire army like Megatron, it's a lot of power to corrupt. The turning point happens at the end of Dark Cybertron, where Shockwave's own plans and ambitions are part of the wake-up call for Megatron. He is used as part of the scheme. He is the oppressed and captured and tormented. And between a repair job from Ratchet that reminded him of what he wanted to be originally, and an unlikely friendship with Bumblebee, who was probably the first one in centuries to actually stand up to him with words and not just try to shoot him in the back, hi Starscream, and actually just kind of confront his mentality. It was the first time that Megatron listened to somebody in a long, long time, because he was in a position where he had no choice. You know, he didn't have his legs at the time. He kind of had to depend on Bumblebee. Kind of funny that way. But it was through Bumblebee's death, and through just the actions of Shockwave, and just made him aware of just how far he had gone, and that his original intent was to win people over by changing their minds, not by dominating them. So, at the end of that storyline, he accepts capture. He does what Megatron does, is that he's mentally 3 steps ahead of everyone else. He pulls some obscure laws to get out of his impending execution sentence, claiming that he can get judgment by the Knights of Cybertron because his crimes were so heinous. Well, the Lost Light's trying to find them. So guess what? You have to travel with the Lost Light to try and find them now. The fun part about this storyline is it's always hard to tell what's going through Megatron's head, because we know what Megatron has always been like through either the original cartoon, the comic books, or of course, the IDW run itself. We knew Megatron was always thinking ahead of everyone else, that there was always a grand scheme, there was always a long play. So while you're watching him try to be an Autobot, you're wondering what's the game? What's the twist here? You keep waiting for him to like pull the switch, and like now is when he goes back. Now is when he takes over the ship. Now is when he kills Rodimus in his sleep, you know? And that's kind of a driving force in those early issues. We see that again with Ravage. Ravage pops up at a point where he can speak for the audience, going, well, what's the long game here? Like, please tell me there's a long game. You didn't actually, do this. But it is genuine. Megatron didn't postpone his execution because he wanted to get out of it. He accepts what he did. He will accept punishment. But he doesn't want his legacy to be that of a tyrant who murdered, half the population of Cybertron. He wants it to be, he wants some level of redemption. He wants to atone for what he's done. Seemingly insurmountable to do something like that, but he wants to try. He feels like finding the Knights of Cybertron could accomplish that, at least a little bit. He just wants something in his legacy to be remembered for, other than all the crimes he did, all the war crimes, let's put it that way. But even then, you see the old Megatron, and you still wonder, really? Or is he just lying to Ravage now? Because he has those outbursts of anger where, like, he'll aim his arm, like he's instinctively aiming his arm cannon, even though he doesn't have it anymore. You'll see moments where someone like Skids, of all bots, is browbeating him for not showing empathy for life forms that aren't Cybertronian, even though he's claiming to hold Autobot values now. It's an interesting story beat when Skids can hold the high ground over Megatron, right? Like, that's not something you'd see in any other situation. But it's the kind of conflicts that we saw. It's inner conflicts. It is a Megatron that is constantly struggling with who he is now and the reminders of who he was, whether that's the Autobots on board the Lost Light that are constantly reminding him of what he used to be, or scenes like one of my favorite scenes in the run was the flower field on the Necro world, because they in the Necro world statues of like big deal Cybertronians are erected, and around it are little blue flowers, tiny blue flowers, and one is planted for every spark or every life lost due to that person. And Megatron, his statue, Megatron stands at his own statue, and in every direction, as far as the eye can see, is blue. There's no more grass, no more green can be found. It is just an ocean of blue flowers. There's so much gravity to having a visualization of how many lives Megatron has taken that has so much weight to it. It's a fantastic moment. It's just like there's just genuine horror in what you see, even though visually it's beautiful. I love that contrast too, and that coincides with elements like Megatron admitting, in his therapy sessions of all things, that he's happiest he's ever been. At the time believing that he was on like tainted energon to keep his energy low and to keep him, like basically medicating him to be happy is what he thought was going on. And is what the readers thought was going on, because that's part of the Autobot Council's orders to keep Megatron under control. But Ratchet doesn't believe in that. Ratchet thought that was disgusting, so he hasn't been doing it. He was getting a placebo. Everything Megatron had done, is the realization that everything that Megatron had done was his own choice, and that he really was holding himself back without any help. To have that realization for him and the reader is also a huge moment, because it's the one point where you finally kind of click that Megatron actually is trying. He actually is, remembering who he used to be before he was the tyrant, and he really was trying to be that person again. He was struggling with it. It was difficult for him. I think there is something to credit about a hero that knows what he was and still tries to be someone better. I think that's where a strength like Harley Quinn comes from, where there's sins that you cannot atone for, but they're trying nonetheless. And when the effort to atone is genuine like that, it's overwhelming how difficult it would be to ever compensate for what they have done, but they still try anyway. And I love a story of a hero like that, because it's so like, Superman has strength and powers. He has a good heart, and he's never done wrong in his life. So, of course he is like the ideal hero, but there's no guilt to overcome. There is nothing he feels like he has to atone for. He's just good, so he will always be good, and he will always be the hero. It's a very different thing to have been on the other side and decide this is who I was, but I want to be something better. I love stories like that. I think it's why we love character. I think it's why we love characters like Dinobot, because they used to be like that, but they want to be better, and they're trying to be better. It's the old, like there's an old saying with courage. It's like courage is not the absence of fear. It is, it is being able to overcome fear. So it's a lot stronger than simply just I'm a good guy. I do, and I love that about it. So we had moments where, the old Megatron's still there. We saw that when he fought the DJD. But the new Megatron is there too. The pain he felt when Ravage died, and the joy when his friend turned up as one of the ones that was asleep on Necro World. That's really special to me too. The fact that he could have those moments of genuine emotion when he is just a tyrant. You can't get emotion out of a character who's just a one-note tyrant. I love having. I love seeing a Megatron that like actually has some emotion to him and might actually care, even though he's still, that kind of terrible person. So you could probably tell, like, I really, really like what they did. I love the story that they told because it's an improbable story to turn Megatron into a hero, but they did go through all the steps they needed to do to try and make that as convincing as possible. They relayed the backstory. They showed why he became what he was, who he used to be, which I think is the most important part, is reconnecting him to his own past, and then, trying to expand from there to go from the would be, to become the rebel leader to the tyrant, and then once again trying to be, atone for it. I think it says a lot. The ending of the story for Lost Lights says so much about the journey Megatron goes through, because you have moments where he was trapped in the Functionist universe for centuries. When he comes back, we hear him being credited for saving billions of lives, but Megatron still laments because he could have saved more. It's an Optimus Prime thing to say, isn't it? This is happening at a time when Optimus Prime, meanwhile in his book, is genuinely being like kind of manipulative and shady. Like, we had this like weird role reversal in IDW where Optimus had to be more Decepticon like to get things accomplished, whereas Megatron was trying to almost like live up to Optimus's original example. It's weird. It's weird, but it's fascinating because it's story we don't normally get. It's not the same old Optimus Megatron story, which is what we're getting in IDW now. It's different, it's special, it's unique, and I love it for that. So at this point, we know he's credited for saving billions of lives. He spent centuries being, the protector against the Functionists and their flying Cybertron, which is, essentially the biggest Death Star ever. It breaches our universe. Megatron is instrumental in helping to stop it. It comes to a point where they have a lot of matrices that were mass produced, and in IDW, opening them up requires a morality lock. You have to believe that you are worthy of opening the matrix in order to actually do so. That's why that's their little explanation for why Galvatron couldn't open it in the movie, etc. And I kind of go with that. It's a little bit weird how the hell, but again, it's a matrix. Of course, like I will admit, like, it can also be a mood ring that will determine whether or not you are a good person in order to actually open it up and use its power. I will believe that because it is the Matrix. But you think about 500 years of saving lives, of being an Autobot, the only Autobot in the Functionist universe, having all of those, basically, being a hero to billions, and to look at all of the good that he did in those centuries and all the good he did aboard the Lost Light and how much he changed. And when it came down to it, Megatron could not open the Matrix as planned. Everyone else could after a pep talk from Rodimus Prime. Even the likes of, like, there are even Decepticons that helped open a Matrix. There was Whirl, who was a bloodthirsty sociopath. Did something just change in my background? You know what? Never mind. So when Megatron tries to open up the Matrix and it can't, again, there's a gravity to the moment that is, they worked really, really hard to create. We know this is a Megatron who's tried very hard to atone, very hard to become the person he originally wanted to be, and Megatron is responsible for saving billions of lives. And yet, even now, in this moment, after centuries of being the hero of an entire universe, he still cannot forgive himself. He still does not believe that he is a good person. No matter how much good he's done, he still does not believe that he deserves to be called good. He doesn't deserve to open a matrix. It's incredibly telling of the journey that he's gone on, that he understands the gravity of what he did and how many sins he committed. That no matter how hard he tried, he's still just not a good person, not to him. So when he's eventually led to the gallows, or what we assume is going to be the gallows, it's left ambiguous what his final punishment's going to end up being. He is he is comfortable with the idea that no matter what it is, he deserves worse. He knows that and he accepts that. It's almost tragic. It's tragic. He has spent literally centuries trying to live up to the Autobot ideal and doing so. And actually, yes, from the outside, we can see he's a better person. He has become a genuine Autobot. He has been responsible for saving billions of lives, Cybertronian and otherwise. And he has grown greatly. My favorite moment is when he returns from the Functionist universe for the first time, and he's got a cannon strapped to his arm again. But the first thing he does is go to a dying Drift, take this cannon off his arm, and it unfolds into an emergency kit, and he saves Drift's life on the spot. Brilliant. I love the twist to that. That now it's a familiar feel to him, but it's not a weapon of murder. It's a weapon of mercy. It shows just how much he's changed as a person, as a character, and how much he's gone through. And he still doesn't believe in himself, even though we as the readers and the other Autobots who traveled with him believe that, yeah, he is not who he was before. And there is something wrong about sending this person to his death when he's done so much good and when he's tried so hard to be better and when he's genuinely become better. When you have Rodimus, who was gleeful for his impending execution, now lying to the jury about what happened when he tried to open the Matrix, that's telling. When you have Magnus, of all people, like the super rule strict Magnus, admitting that Megatron is his friend, and admitting, like, yeah, I'll take your advice, I'll cast off my armor, I'll be the person I really am, and Megatron being encouraging about that. You are so much bigger without that armor. It's so to judge the storyline, to judge it based solely on it's Megatron as an Autobot, is to do such an injustice to so many years of good writing to get to that point, to get from the tyrant that's still trying to overthrow Cybertron to the one who's essentially responsible for giving the Transformers a new Cybertron after Unicron destroyed it. There's so much to the character, to the story they wrote, when you really dive into it and think about what Megatron was going through mentally and the journey that he went through to ultimately decide it was futile in the first place because there is no good he can do that will outweigh the wrong that he has done. Even literally saving Cybertron and giving a new home to every Transformer in the galaxy, he still does not believe he is a good person. It's tragic, is what it is. It turns Megatron, to give Megatron a positive past that went negative turns him into a tragic figure, and then into a tragic hero who, no matter how hard he tries, just can't convince himself that that's who he is. I think it tells a very fascinating picture of Megatron, one that I've never seen duplicated, and one I don't think I would want to see duplicated. The idea of Autobot Megatron is inherently weird, but it's not anything I'm trying to think of a parallel, because we never got to see Skeletor as a hero. We did once. There was one episode, but we never saw Skeletor have a change of heart. We never saw Cobra Commander have a change of heart. We never saw Shredder, or Lord Zed have a change of heart. That never happens. But it is interesting to see when a villain decides they don't want to be a villain anymore. And we've seen that throughout Transformers. I talk about my favorite G1 Decepticon, Blitzwing, going through something like that. We talk about Dinobot, he was the character of Beast Wars because of that. And similar to Megatron, we saw him go through turmoil, this personal inner struggle to try and go from like who he was, and what kind of person he was to who he wants to be, upholding to an ideal that he didn't, that he wasn't born with. It tells an interesting story, and to tell it with Megatron is not only bold, it's unique, and we're never going to see that story told again, because Megatron's always going to be the villain from here on out. So that's what I would say to the detractors of that storyline. Let us have it. If you're going to judge it based solely on the 2 words Autobot Megatron, and you're going to throw out all the writing that came before that to build up to that moment, and you're going to throw out all the writing afterwards that told a really interesting story, at the very least admit, prior to that, Megatron spent 30 years as the mustache-twirling, death-ray-building, cliche villain. With Beast Wars Megatron breaking that mold for a few years before he basically went right back to it. He's always been that. In the cartoons, in the comic books, in the movies, he's always been the one-note villain. There have been Megatrons that are more intimidating, more nuanced, more logical, more intelligent, but ultimately, they are always going to be the ultimate villain. Here's one story that tells a different different story from Megatron, that gives us an origin that we can relate to, that has real-world parallels, that has a journey through becoming a tyrant and then trying to redeem himself. Yes, Autobot Megatron is an out-there concept that some are always going to hate, but at least give credit for having one story where we get to explore it and actually see what it would be like and what has to be done in order to make that story happen. And let's just let us have that. If you're going to hate on the story just because of the outcome, let's just let us, who enjoy the story, have it. Because you've already had 30 years of Megatron as the big villain. And guess what? You're probably going to have 30 more years as Megatron as the big villain. That's not going to change just because IDW did it once. So let it stand as the one-time scenario that we're likely never going to see again. And you're free to hate it. You're free to say it's terrible writing. You're free to an opinion. But I am free to disagree. I find the writing to be very, very well done, very well thought out, and genuinely enjoyable. It is one of my favorite story arcs of IDW 1.0. Up there with Wingblade and Starscream's rivalry, again, through the last years of the comic book. I genuinely love the writing in IDW 1.0 most of the time. And yes, Autobot Megatron is one of my favorite things. I have the model kit from Kotobukiya of that particular Megatron, and I'm very happy to have it up there. I need to get the Rodimus. Now that I think about it, I need to go back and get the Rodimus too, because I have him. I need to have both captains of the Lost Light together. So that is my thoughts and opinions. Very long-winded video, but I had a lot to cover, and I wanted to make sure that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to make sure I spoiled the story for everybody. I wanted to make sure I told every little twist and ruined it for anyone who hadn't read that story arc before. I apologize for that, but hey, you clicked on the video, you should have known what you were getting into. But I had thoughts about the more I thought about this, the more I thought I had thoughts about every step of the way in this storyline. So I wanted to cover everything, get it all out of the way, and make sure this is the only video I'm ever going to have to do about Autobot Megatron. So, I hope it was satisfactory. Thank you guys for listening to me ramble. And hopefully, next time, I'm going to try to get a few more of those Patreon requests out. So we're going to see a lot more of a viewer-requested material as the month goes on. So stay tuned for it, and I hope to see you there. If you want to see it, hit the subscribe, hit the like button, make sure this channel survives, and I will see you next time. Guys, I am facing the most powerful enemy any YouTuber can face, the algorithm, and I need your help to defeat him. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment. Every time you do, we attack that algorithm and we drive it back until it can no longer defeat this channel. Thank you very much.